The Duke mocked the crowd, promising marriage to any lady who could beat him in a sword fight. He expected laughter, not a challenger. A young blacksmith's daughter stepped forward in a plain riding habit and disarmed him in seconds. What he didn't know, she hadn't come for his title or his hand. She had come for something far greater, and he was about to help her take it. The foil hit the grass with a soft thud, and for 3 full seconds, no one in the garden made a sound. 200 guests stood frozen. A gentleman near the rose hedges still held his teacup halfway to his lips. A countess in pale lilac muslin had stopped fanning herself mid-air. Even the string quartet on the pavilion had let their bows slide off the strings. The blade that lay in the grass belonged to His Grace Cassian Whitlock, the Duke of Broadmoor, and the young woman standing across from him, breathing easy, was not anyone he had ever seen before. Let me take you back half an hour. The spring gala at Broadmoor Estate was the talk of 3 counties. Every May, Duke Cassian threw open the gates of his country house in Hertfordshire and welcomed half of England's nobility onto his lawns. White silk pavilions rose like sails between the old oak trees. Footmen in dark blue livery carried silver trays of iced lemon water and small glasses of claret. The air smelled of cut grass, hyacinths, and the faint smoke drifting from the great kitchens where the evening supper was already being prepared. Cassian himself was the picture of a gentleman duke. Tall, dark-haired, with the easy laugh of a man who had never been told no. He wore a fawn-colored tailcoat over a white waistcoat, his cravat tied in the loose, new style that the younger lords had taken up that season. At 28, he was considered the most eligible bachelor in the south of England, and he wore that title the way other men wore their watch chains, with a kind of polished, careless pride. The fencing exhibition was meant to be the entertainment of the afternoon. Cassian had defeated 3 opponents already, the captain of a hussar regiment, his own cousin, Lord Henley, and an Italian fencing master visiting from Bath. The crowd clapped politely after each match. The ladies sipped from their glasses. Mothers whispered behind their fans about which of their daughters might next catch the Duke's eye. It was after the 3rd bout that Cassian, flushed and laughing, raised his foil in a mock salute to the gallery. "My friends," he called out, "I am beginning to find this dull. Perhaps we ought to raise the stakes." Laughter rippled across the lawn. "A duke must never run short of challengers, must he? So let me throw down a gauntlet of my own." He paused, smiling at the sea of muslin gowns and silk parasols. "If any lady here can best me with the foil, I shall offer her my hand in marriage." The laughter doubled. A few gentlemen cheered. Lady Henley, watching from the edge of the pavilion, rolled her eyes and muttered something to her companion. The young ladies blushed and giggled and looked at one another over the edges of their fans. It was a charming joke, the kind of thing one repeats in carriages on the way home from a gala. The Duke was being his usual self. Then a voice spoke from the back of the crowd. "I accept, Your Grace." The laughter died as if cut with shears. Heads turned, skirts rustled. A path opened through the gathering, and along it walked a young woman who did not, at first glance, belong in the painting at all. She was perhaps 23. Her hair was the color of dark honey, pulled into a plain knot at the nape of her neck. She wore no silk, no pearls, no fine muslin. Her dress was a riding habit of dove-gray tweed, sturdy and well cut, with a high collar and a single bone button at the throat. Her boots were dusty from the road. Across her shoulder she carried a long, narrow case of dark walnut wood. She stopped at the edge of the dueling square, set the case down on the grass, and opened it. The foil inside caught the afternoon light. It was a beautiful thing, slender, perfectly balanced, with a guard of polished steel and a grip wrapped in pale leather. The blade itself seemed almost to hum, the way fine steel does when it has been worked by careful hands. She lifted the weapon, tested its weight against her palm, and stepped onto the dueling ground. Cassian stared at her. The crowd held its breath. For a moment, he seemed unsure what to do. Then his polished smile returned. "My lady, I confess I do not know your name." "Clara Ashford," she said. "Miss Ashford." He bowed with practiced grace. "I would not wish to embarrass you in front of so many witnesses. Are you quite certain?" "Quite certain, Your Grace." There was something in the way she said it, calm even, without any heat. The Duke paused. But pride is a difficult thing to put down once one has picked it up, and the gallery was watching. He bowed again and raised his blade. "En garde, then!" Their foils touched. What followed lasted less than 10 seconds. Cassian opened with a fast, straight thrust, expecting her to flinch. She did not. Her blade slid against his, light and sure, and turned his point aside. He recovered, tried a feint to the left, and lunged for the right. Clara was already moving. Her wrist twisted in a small, precise circle that the Duke had seen performed perhaps twice in his life, by men who had spent 20 years with a foil in their hand. The motion caught the bell of his guard, lifted and snapped. His weapon flew. It turned in the air, a flash of silver against the blue spring sky, and came down point first in the grass, 6 paces away. Silence. A teacup paused at a lip. A fan stopped in midair. The quartet's bows slid off their strings, and Clara Ashford, in her dusty boots and grey tweed, lowered her own blade and waited, perfectly still, for the Duke of Broadmoor to say something. The Duke of Broadmoor's drawing room had been built to impress, and it usually did. The walls were panelled in dark mahogany. A pair of tall windows looked out over the south lawn, where the last of the gala guests were still being helped into their carriages. Beeswax candles burned in silver holders on the mantelpiece, and a small fire crackled in the grate against the cool of the evening. The whole room smelled of wood smoke, polished wood, and the bergamot of fresh tea. Clara sat in a wing-back chair near the fire, her hands folded in her lap. The walnut case rested on the floor beside her boots. She had not changed her dress. She had not asked to wash the dust from her hands. She had simply followed the butler down the long corridor and taken the seat she was offered, as if she had walked into a country inn rather than the private parlor of one of the richest men in England. Cassian poured the tea himself. It was the sort of small courtesy a duke offered only to people he wished to honor, and his footman, standing by the door, raised his eyebrows just a little. Cassian handed her a cup of fine bone china, took the chair opposite, and studied her over the rim of his own. "Miss Ashford," he said, "I am a man of my word." "I am aware, Your Grace." "Then you understand that what I said on the lawn this afternoon was a binding pledge made before 200 witnesses. The Whitlock name has stood for 4 centuries on the simple principle that what we say, we do." He set his cup down on the small table at his elbow. "I have already spoken with my solicitor. He will draw up the marriage settlement in the morning. You shall have a generous portion of your own, a London house if you wish it, and the protection of my title and family from this day forward." He had expected, perhaps, a stunned silence, tears of gratitude, a trembling acceptance. He had seen those things on the faces of young women who had been merely smiled at by him, and this one had beaten him with a foil before the whole county. Clara took a small sip of her tea. She set the cup back on its saucer with a tiny click. "I thank you, Your Grace," she said, "but I must decline." Cassian blinked. "I beg your pardon? I do not wish to marry you." For a long moment, the only sound was the soft pop of a log shifting in the fire. The footman by the door went so still he might have been a piece of furniture. "Forgive me." The Duke leaned forward a fraction. "I have not, I believe, ever been refused before. Not for tea, not for a turn about the garden, certainly not for my hand. May I ask, Miss Ashford, what part of my offer you find lacking?" "None of it, sir." She met his eyes squarely. "Your offer is more than generous. It is the marriage itself I do not want." "You have an objection to me, personally?" "I have no opinion of you at all, Your Grace. I met you 4 hours ago." He laughed then, a short, startled laugh, and for the first time since they had sat down, he looked at her as if she were a problem to be solved.
"Well, that is honest, at least." He sat back. "Then I must ask the question that any gentleman would ask. If you did not come to Broadmoor to win a duke, Miss Ashford, why did you come at all?" Clara reached down and lifted the walnut case onto her lap. She turned it so that the lid faced him and opened it. The foil lay inside on a bed of dark velvet. In the candlelight it seemed even finer than it had on the lawn. The steel had a faint pattern in it, like watered silk, that shifted as the blade moved. "This was made by my father," she said. "His name was Thomas Ashford. He was a master bladesmith in the town of Hatherley, near the iron country in the north. He spent 40 years at his anvil, and the last 2 years of his life he spent on this one foil. He finished it the week before he died. He never had the chance to sell it, or to show it to anyone of consequence." Her voice did not waver, but her thumb passed once, lightly, over the leather of the grip. "My father left me his workshop, his ledger, and his manuals. The workshop has debts, the ledger is thin. The manuals are worth more than gold, but only if the right men know they exist." She looked up. "There were a dozen of England's wealthiest sporting gentlemen on your lawn this afternoon, Your Grace. Members of the London fencing clubs, officers of the cavalry, men who buy fine blades. I needed every one of them to see with their own eyes what an Ashford foil can do." Cassian was silent for a long moment. "You used my challenge." "I used your challenge." "You knew I would issue it." "You have issued it at the spring gala for 3 years running, sir. It is in every gossip column in the South." The Duke stared at her. Then, slowly, he began to smile. It was not the polished smile he had worn on the lawn. It was something smaller and more genuine, the kind of smile a man wears when he has been outplayed at his own table and is just beginning to enjoy it. "Miss Ashford," he said, "I think you may be the most interesting person I have met this year." She closed the case. "I did not come to be interesting, Your Grace. I came to save my father's forge." The livery coach rocked over the cobblestones of the high road, its iron-shod wheels rattling against the stones in a steady, uneven rhythm. It was a hired carriage, plain black with a single driver, and Cassian had insisted on it himself. A ducal coach with its painted arms would draw attention all the way from Hertfordshire to the iron country, and Clara had said, very plainly over breakfast, that she did not wish to ride into Hatherley with a coronet announcing her arrival. So here he sat, on a narrow leather bench, wearing a plain bottle-green coat and a beaver hat instead of his usual finery, watching the spring countryside roll past the window. Hedgerows white with hawthorn blossom, a shepherd boy driving a small flock along a sunken lane, bluebells in the shadows of an oak wood. England in May, as fine as it ever looked. Clara sat opposite him, her tweed habit brushed clean, the walnut case across her knees. She had spent the first hour of the journey looking out of the window in silence. He had not pressed her. A man who has been refused a hand of marriage and then accepted as a traveling companion in the space of one night learns, quickly, when to hold his tongue. It was past noon when she spoke. "You did not have to come, Your Grace." "I am aware." "You have estates to manage, a gala to recover from, a great many letters of bewilderment from your aunts to answer." He smiled. 3 of those letters arrived before breakfast. "My Aunt Margaret has decided that you must be a French spy." "And what have you decided, sir?" "I have decided that I should very much like to see the workshop where that foil was made." She studied him for a moment. The carriage jolted over a rut, and her hand steadied the case. "You may call me Cassian," he said, "while we are on the road.
Your grace is a long word, and we have a long way still to go. I shall consider it. That made him laugh, properly, the way he had on the lawn before he knew he was beaten. He stretched his legs out as far as the cramped box would allow and tipped his hat back a fraction. Tell me about your father, Miss Ashford. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she did. Thomas Ashford had been the third son of a Sheffield cutler. He had walked away from his father's house at 15 with a hammer and a leather apron and nothing else, and he had ended up in Hatherley because the iron there came out of the ground with a strange purity, and because the river that turned the wheel of his forge ran cold and clean all year round. He had married a parson's daughter who could read Latin, and she had taught Clara to read it too, between bouts of working the bellows. She had died when Clara was 12. Her father had not married again.
He used to say that steel was a kind of memory, Clara said.
The carriage swayed, and her voice steadied with it.
Iron forgets. You can beat it into a horseshoe one day and a nail the next, and it will sit quite happily as either. But steel, properly tempered, remembers what it was made to be. A blade that has been folded and quenched at the right heat by the right hand will hold its shape for 100 years. He thought that was the closest a man could come to leaving something true behind.
Cassian listened. He had been to a great many dinners where the conversation was politely empty, and he had learned the precise weight of words that meant nothing. Clara's words had weight. And the secret of the tempering, he said. That is what is in the manuals. Part of it. There is a great deal that is in his hands and his eye, and that died with him. But the heat tables, the timings, the mixtures for the coals, the way to read the color of the metal as it changes, all of that he wrote down. He spent the last winter of his life copying it out into fair hand for me, because he knew. Knew what? That his lungs were going. The smoke catches up with every smith in the end. The carriage was quiet for a little while after that. The road climbed a low ridge, and through the window Cassian could see, in the far distance, the first thin pencil lines of factory smoke rising over the horizon. The iron country, beginning. There is a thing I do not understand, Miss Ashford. Only one, sir? For now, he smiled. You are a young woman of remarkable skill and a remarkable inheritance. There must be a dozen ways you could have brought your father's work to the notice of the right men. A letter of introduction from the vicar, a demonstration at the Sheffield assemblies. Why a duke's lawn and a duke's foolish challenge? Clara looked at him for a long moment. Because no one writes about the Sheffield assemblies in the London papers, Your Grace, and a letter from a country vicar to a London gentleman is read once and used to light a pipe. But a woman who beats the Duke of Broadmoor at the spring gala will be talked of in every coffee house from the Strand to St. James's by Wednesday morning. He stared at her. You did not only mean to be seen by the men on my lawn. No, sir. You meant to be seen by every man in London who reads a newspaper. Yes, sir. Cassian sat back against the leather. Outside the window, the smoke on the horizon thickened, and Hatherley drew slowly closer. Miss Ashford, he said, I am going to need a great deal more tea. Hatherley was a town built around its furnaces. The river ran black with the runoff from the dye works above the bridge, and the air had a permanent taste of coal smoke and hot iron. Rows of soot-streaked brick cottages climbed the hill above the water, and at the bottom of the hill, in a yard set back from the high street, stood the Ashford forge. The coach stopped at the gate. Cassian stepped down first and offered his hand. Clara, who had not taken his hand once on the journey, surprised him by taking it now, just for the step. The forge yard was a square of packed earth bordered by a low brick wall. Against the far side stood the workshop itself, a long building of dark brick with a single tall chimney and a wide doorway that stood open to the spring air. Inside, Cassian could see the dim shapes of two anvils, a great water trough, and a hearth banked low. The smell that came out of the doorway was the smell of cold ash and old metal, and underneath it something sharper, like rain on warm steel. A boy of about 12 was sweeping the yard. He stopped when he saw Clara, and his whole small face changed.
Miss Clara! Tom.
She put down the walnut case and rested a hand briefly on the boy's shoulder.
Has the post come? Aye, miss, and Mr. Sterling.
Clara went very still.
He is here? In the workshop. He would not be sent away. I tried.
Cassian saw her jaw set in a way he was beginning to recognize. She picked up the case again and walked across the yard, and he followed her into the workshop. A man was standing by the larger of the two anvils. He had his back to the door, and he was running his thumb along the edge of an unfinished blade clamped in a vise. He was perhaps 50, square-built, in a fine wool coat that did not quite belong in a forge yard. He turned when their boots scraped the threshold. "Miss Ashford." A smile spread under a heavy grey mustache. "You have been a great deal harder to reach this week than usual. I had begun to fear you were avoiding me."
"Mr. Sterling, please put down my work."
He glanced at the blade in the vise as if he had not noticed it. He set it back with exaggerated care. "A handsome piece. Your father's pattern?"
"My pattern, from his teaching."
"Quite so, quite so." Sterling's eyes flicked to Cassian, took in the bottle-green coat, the cut of it, the boots, and made a swift calculation. "And this gentleman?"
"A friend of the family."
"A friend with London tailoring." Sterling's smile sharpened. "We are coming up in the world, Miss Ashford." Clara did not answer. She set the walnut case down on a workbench and folded her arms. "You have had my answer twice in writing, Mr. Sterling. I have nothing further to say to you." "Ah, but I have a great deal further to say to you." Sterling spread his hands in a friendly fashion. "I have been more than fair. I have offered a good price for your late father's manuals. I have offered to keep on your boy here, and the journeyman Pike, and even old Mrs. Hadley who comes to scrub the floor. I have offered to put your father's name on the gates of my new factory, in iron letters 2 feet high, so that every man in Hatherley will know what a tribute Sterling Ironworks pays to its forebears. And in return, you wish to break apart every blade my father stood for, and stamp out 1,000 cheap copies a week. I wish to feed 200 families, Miss Ashford, which is more than this little yard does. 200 families turning out brittle steel that snaps in a man's hand." Sterling's smile thinned. "Careful." "It is the truth, sir. I have seen your blades. The temper is wrong. The carbon is wrong. You buy cheap pig iron from Wales and you do not fold it enough. And any sporting gentleman with a foil in his hand for 3 months can tell the difference between your work and mine inside 10 seconds. Inside 10 seconds? Sterling's voice had dropped. Like the Duke of Broadmoor, perhaps. The silence in the workshop changed. Clara did not move. Cassian, who had stayed by the door, took one quiet step forward. "So the rumor is true." Sterling's eyes did not leave Clara. "You went down to Hertfordshire and made a spectacle of yourself for the gossip sheets. I confess I did not believe it when I read it this morning. A respectable smith's daughter, prancing about with a foil in front of half the peerage. Your father would weep." "My father would applaud, sir." "Your father is dead, Miss Ashford, and a young woman cannot run a forge alone in this town. The bank holds the lease on this yard. The bank, as you may know, does business with me. By the end of this week, I shall have the papers, and by the end of the month, you shall have a choice between selling me the manuals at a price I name, or watching the bailiffs walk in through that gate." Cassian spoke then, for the first time. "That will do." Sterling turned. He had not, perhaps, expected the bottle-green coat to speak with quite that voice. "And you are, sir?" "Broadmoor." The word landed in the workshop like a hammer on the anvil. Sterling's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Your Grace." "Mr. Sterling, you will leave Miss Ashford's property now. You will not return without her written invitation,
and you will speak to her bank tomorrow morning and withdraw any pressure you have brought to bear upon her lease." Cassian's voice was perfectly even. "Am I understood?" Sterling stared at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his hat, walked past them without a word, and was gone. The rain began a little after 9. It came on slowly at first, a soft tapping at the window panes of the Forge cottage, and then settled into a steady drumming that carried on the wind off the moors. The cottage sat at the back of the workshop yard, joined to the forge by a covered passage of brick, and inside it was small but warm, a parlor with 2 armchairs and a deal table, a narrow kitchen, a study at the back hung with old maps of the Iron Country and lit that night by a single oil lantern on the desk. Clara sat at the desk. The walnut case was open beside her. Spread across the wood in front of her were her father's papers. There were a great many of them, loose sheets covered in fine, slanted hand, bound notebooks in soft black leather, folded sheets of brown paper with diagrams drawn in red ink and annotated in 3 different colors, the geometry of a blade, the cross-section of a hilt, a long table of heat and time marked at the top with a single underlined word: patience. She had been at the desk for 2 hours, and she had sorted perhaps a quarter of it. In the parlor next door, Cassian had taken the chair nearest the passage door. He had a foil across his knees, one of Clara's spares, and a book in his hand that he was not really reading. The lantern light from the study fell through the half-open door in a pale yellow stripe across the rug. A little before midnight, Clara came through with a fresh pot of tea on a tray.
"You will fall asleep, sir, if you keep staring at that book."
"I have been staring at the same page for an hour. I had not the heart to turn it." She set the tray on the small table between the chairs and poured. The rain hammered against the cottage roof. Somewhere in the forge yard, a loose shutter creaked on its hinge. "He will not come tonight," Cassian said. "I know. He has not had time to set anything in motion. He will need a day at least, 2 more likely." "I know." She handed him a cup. She did not sit. She stood by the parlor window, looking out into the wet darkness of the yard, her hand cupped around her own tea for the warmth of it. "I have not thanked you," she said. "There is no need." "There is every need. He would have walked out of that workshop tonight with the manuals in his coat if you had not been there. He had brought a leather satchel. Did you see it? On the bench by the door?" Cassian had not seen it. He thought back, and yes, there had been a satchel. "He came prepared to take them by force? By bluster. He thought the boy and I would not stop him. He has been correct twice before." The cup paused at Cassian's lip. "Twice?" "He sent men in February. They did not get past Pike, our journeyman. Pike is 60 and small, but he has a smith's grip and he had a poker. They left without speaking. In March, he came himself with 2 of his clerks and took 3 of the lesser notebooks off this very desk while I was out at the bank. I got them back in the end. I had to walk into his counting house in the high street and ask for them, in front of his clerks and a customer. He gave them up rather than have the scene continue, but it was a near thing." Cassian set the cup down. "You have been fighting this man for months." "Since November." "Alone?" "Pike helps. Tom helps. Mrs. Hadley brings soup." "Miss Ashford." She turned from the window. The lantern light from the study caught the side of her face, the firm line of her jaw, the small honey-colored hairs that had come loose at her temple. "It is what one does, sir, when a thing is worth keeping." He did not answer that. She set down her own cup, untouched, and went back into the study. After a moment he rose, foil in hand, and followed as far as the doorway. She had pulled a fresh sheet from the center of the desk and laid it flat under the lantern. He stepped close enough to see. It was a drawing of a foil blade in cross-section, but not a simple one.
The metal of the blade was shown in fine layers, like the rings of a tree, and each layer was numbered. Beside the drawing were 3 small columns of figures: heat in degrees, time in minutes and quarter minutes. A third column he did not understand, with letters and small marks.
What is the third column? The color of the metal at each stage. He invented his own notation for it: straw, pale straw, dark straw, brown, purple, blue, dark blue. He could read it by eye in a darkened workshop. Most smiths cannot read it at all by lamplight, only in full sun. And this, Cassian's finger hovered over the layered drawing without touching the page. These rings, this is the folding? 17 folds. Most good blades have 9. Some Italian work goes to 12. My father went to 17 because he found that the 17th fold produced a particular spring in the metal that no other smith in England has matched. A spring. Bend a sterling blade past a certain angle and it snaps. Bend an Ashford blade past the same angle and it bends a little further, sings, and returns to true. It is the difference between a weapon that lasts a season and a weapon that lasts a lifetime. Cassian looked at the page for a long moment. "Miss Ashford," he said quietly, "this is not a workshop. This is a cathedral." She did not smile, but something in her shoulders eased. "Then help me keep its roof on, Your Grace." "I shall." It was the sound of a boot on slate that woke him. Cassian had not meant to sleep. He had taken the parlor chair with the foil across his knees and the lantern turned low, and he had told himself he would sit out the hours until dawn. The rain had stopped a little after 1. The cottage had gone quiet. Somewhere between 2 and 3, his head had tipped against the wing of the chair, and his eyes had closed. And the next thing he knew, there was a soft, deliberate scrape from the roof of the covered passage that joined the cottage to the forge. He came awake without moving. A man who has hunted with the hounds since he was 12 learns to wake in stages. Boot, slate, 2 men, perhaps. The slope of the passage roof ran low, easy to climb from the back wall of the yard. The forge chimney stood at the far end of that passage, square brick and a man's height across at the base. He rose without a sound, set the book on the seat behind him, and lifted the foil. Clara was already at the study door. She had not been to bed. She had her own blade in her hand, and her hair was still pinned up. She put a finger to her lips. He nodded. They went together through the kitchen, took the side door instead of the front, and stepped out into the cold of the pre-dawn yard. The mist was thick. It came up off the river in white drifts that hid the far wall entirely and lay in waist-deep pools across the packed earth. The sky above was the color of pewter, with the first thin gray of morning showing in the east. Everything dripped. 2 shapes were on the passage roof. Cassian could just make them out against the lighter wall of the chimney. One held something bulky, a sack perhaps, or a bundle of wet sacking. The other was crouched at the chimney's mouth, working a long pole down into the flue. Clara breathed out very softly through her teeth. "They mean to stop the draw," she whispered. "Pack the chimney with wet sacking. The forge will not light tomorrow. Or it will light and fill the workshop with smoke and ruin every blade in the racks. And the reputation. And the reputation. A forge that cannot burn clean is a forge that cannot work." They went round the long way, along the inside of the yard wall where the mist lay deepest. The men on the roof were too busy to look down. Cassian could hear one of them muttering, a thin, anxious voice telling the other to be quick. The pole scraped against the inside of the flue. There was a ladder leaning against the passage wall. Their ladder, left in plain sight in the confidence of men who did not expect to be interrupted. Cassian pulled it down, quietly, and laid it flat in the mud. Then he stepped out into the open and spoke, in the clear, carrying voice of a man addressing a tenant on rent day. "Good morning, gentlemen." The 2 figures on the roof froze. The one with the pole jerked round so sharply that he nearly slipped on the wet slate. The other dropped his bundle of sacking. It fell with a heavy slap into the yard and burst, soaked rags spilling across the earth. "Down, please," Cassian said, slowly. "The ladder is, I am afraid, no longer where you left it." For a moment, the man with the pole seemed to consider jumping. The drop from the passage roof to the cobbles was perhaps 8 feet. Then he saw Clara come round the corner of the forge wall with her foil in her hand, and his nerve went out of him like air from a bellows.
"Don't," he said. "Don't, sir. Miss, we weren't—"
"Down," Cassian repeated. They came down. They had to drop the last part, and they landed badly, one of them turning an ankle in the mud and yelping. They stood in the yard with their hands held a little away from their bodies, two thin, frightened men in working clothes that had seen better winters. Clara stepped forward. She did not point her foil at them. She held it low, the way her father had taught her, the tip resting an inch above the earth. "Names?" "Hobb, miss. Jacob Hobb." "Wills, miss. Edward Wills." "Who sent you here this morning, Mr. Hobb?" The thinner of the two opened his mouth, closed it, and looked at the other man. The other man looked at the ground.
"It was Mr. Sterling, this," the words came out in a rush. "He gave us 5 shillings each and a bottle, and he said if we did this clean and quiet, there'd be a place in the new factory for both of us, week after next. We've neither of us worked since the dye house closed at Michaelmas, miss. My wife's been—"
"Quietly, Mr. Hobb." Clara's voice was not unkind. "I am not your judge, but you will tell that same story, in those same words, to a magistrate this afternoon. Will you do that?" The man swallowed. "Miss, if I do, Sterling will—" "His Grace will see that he does not." Hobb's head came up. He looked properly, for the first time, at the man in the bottle green coat. "His Grace?" "Broadmoor," Cassian said. Both men went the color of cold ash. "You will both come inside," Clara said. "You will be given hot tea and dry coats. You will sit in my kitchen until the magistrate is sent for, and you will be treated as men, not as criminals. In return, you will speak the truth. Is that an agreement?" Hobb nodded. Wills nodded after him. The first true light of morning was coming over the workshop roof. Somewhere down the river, a cock began to crow. Cassian lowered his foil. "Inside, gentlemen. The kettle is already warm." London in the late morning was a wall of sound. The mail coach from the north had set them down at the Bull and Mouth in St. Martin's-le-Grand a little after 10, and from there they had taken a hackney south and west, through streets so thick with traffic that for whole minutes at a stretch the wheels did not turn. Brewers' drays loaded with barrels, costermongers shouting the price of oranges, a flock of geese being driven, somehow, along the Strand by a small boy with a willow switch. The smell of coal smoke and horse and wet stone, and, faintly under it all, the river. Clara had not been to London since she was 9 years old. She sat by the window of the hackney with her hands very still in her lap, the walnut case across her knees, and watched it pass. Cassian watched her watch it. "You are quiet, Miss Ashford." "I am thinking, Your Grace." "Of what?" "Of how many forges this city would swallow without noticing." He did not answer that. He had been born to London. He had not, until that moment, considered it from the point of view of a country smith. The magistrate at Hatherley had been a sensible man. He had taken the statements of Hobb and Wills in his own parlour, with a clerk writing it down in a fair round hand, and he had bound both men over to appear at the assizes in the autumn. He had sent a separate writ to Sterling's counting-house, ordering him to attend a hearing the following week. He had also, on Cassian's quiet request, written a letter of introduction to the secretary of the London Metallurgical Exhibition. That letter sat now in the breast pocket of Cassian's coat. It was, as letters went, very short. It said only that the Duke of Broadmoor begged the courtesy of a presentation slot for Miss Clara Ashford of Hatherley, late of the firm of Thomas Ashford, master bladesmith, and that the matter was one of pressing interest to the sporting gentlemen of the southern counties. The Duke of Broadmoor's name in London opened doors that no ordinary letter could touch. The hackney set them down at last at a coffee-house in the Adelphi, where Cassian had taken rooms for them both on separate floors. Clara had not, he had noticed, raised any objection to that arrangement, only to the cost, which she had insisted on entering in a small notebook to be settled later. She kept the notebook in the walnut case, next to the foil.
They took a private parlor above the street. A pot of coffee was brought up, and a plate of cold ham and bread, and they spread her papers across the table. "The presentation is at 2 tomorrow afternoon," Cassian said. "We have today and tonight." "Show me again, please, the order of the judges." He pulled a sheet from the inside of his coat. He had written it out on the mail coach. "Sir Henry Pelham, master of the Cutler's Hall. He has been a friend of my father's house for 30 years. He will want to see the metallurgy first, the folds, the heat tables, the color notation. He reads diagrams better than he reads people." "Good." "Mr. Forster, he owns half the iron in Birmingham. He cares for one thing, which is profit. You must show him that a fine blade sells for 10 times the price of a poor one and uses less than twice the labor. Have you the figures?" "In the small black notebook." "Then we shall mark the pages this evening." He glanced down the list. "Colonel Tarrant of the Horse Guards. He is the one who matters most for our purposes. He buys foils and sabres for the regimental school. If he is persuaded, every officer's mess in the country will follow him by Michaelmas. And he is the one who will want the demonstration." "He is." Clara set her cup down. "Then I shall need a partner." "You have one." "I had assumed." He smiled. "I have been practicing in the forge yard, Miss Ashford. Pike was kind enough to mark my faults. There are a great many of them." "There are, sir, but you have the wrist for it. We shall do a simple set. 3 exchanges, a feint, a disarm. Not your disarm. We shall let the colonel see what the blade can do under stress, not what I can do at your expense." "I am grateful for the distinction." They worked through the afternoon. She read him passages from the manuals while he wrote out clean copies in his own hand for the judges, 3 sets each, bound with green ribbon from a haberdasher's 2 streets away. She rehearsed her opening words aloud, twice, 3 times, until they no longer sounded like a speech, but like a thing she was saying because it was true. He stopped her once, gently, to suggest she leave out a particular Latin phrase that her mother had taught her. "It is the correct word, sir." "It is the correct word, but Mr. Forster does not have Latin and will think you are showing off." She struck the phrase out. The light began to go a little after 5. A lamplighter came down the street below with his long pole, and one by one the oil lamps along the Adelphi came up, soft yellow flowers in the grey of the evening. Clara stood at the window and watched him. "Your Grace?" "Cassian, when we are alone. I have asked twice." "Cassian." He looked up from the page he was writing. "If we lose tomorrow—" She did not turn. "If the judges go the other way, I shall still have done a thing my father would be proud of. I wanted to say so to you before it happens, in case I do not have the chance after." He set down his pen. "Miss Ashford, we are not going to lose." The hall on Regent Street had been built only the year before, and the glass of its great vaulted roof was still so clean that the afternoon sun came down through it in pale, dust-flecked columns. Below, on a floor of polished oak, perhaps 400 people moved between the long display tables. Gentlemen in dark coats, a scattering of officers in red, a few ladies, very few, in walking dresses of grey and dove blue. The murmur of voices rose into the iron rafters and came back down softened, like the sound of a congregation between hymns. Sterling was already on the floor when they arrived. He had taken a long table near the center of the hall, and he had laid it out handsomely. A green cloth, a row of factory blades polished to a mirror finish, a printed broadsheet in a great many copies advertising Sterling Ironworks of Hatherley,
established 1804, suppliers of fine steel to the trade. A pair of clerks in matching grey waistcoats stood behind the table answering questions, and Sterling himself walked to the front of it, shaking hands. He saw Clara come in. His face did not change. He simply turned, with great deliberation, to the gentleman he was speaking to and continued his sentence. Clara walked past him to the small dais at the far end of the hall, where the judge's table stood. Cassian walked at her shoulder. She wore the grey tweed habit. She had refused, in the rooms above the coffee house that morning, every other dress that Cassian had quietly arranged to have sent up. "They will see me as I am, sir, or they will not see me." Sir Henry Pelham rose to meet them. He was a small man with white side whiskers and a quick, kind eye, and he took Cassian's hand warmly. "Your Grace, a pleasure, as always. And this is Miss Ashford." "It is, Sir Henry." "You have caused, young lady, a very great deal of conversation in this hall today. Mr. Sterling has been telling anyone who will listen that you are a fraud." "Then I had better not be one, Sir Henry." Pelham smiled. He turned to the colonel beside him, a lean grey man with a sabre scar across the back of one hand, and the colonel inclined his head a fraction. "Whenever you are ready, Miss Ashford." Clara stepped up onto the dais. She did not begin with the foil. She began with the papers. She unrolled the cross-section drawing of the 17-fold blade and set it on the easel that had been provided, and she walked the 3 judges through it the way her father had walked her through it when she was 11. The heat tables, the color notation, the why of each fold, and where in the blade its strength lay. She did not raise her voice. She did not hurry. Mr. Forster, who had begun by leaning back in his chair with the air of a man, was sitting forward within 4 minutes and asking questions within 6. Then she came to the demonstration. Cassian came up onto the dais. He took the second foil from the walnut case, the one she had given him at Hatherley, and they took their positions. The hall had grown quiet. Even at Sterling's table, the clerks had stopped talking. They began with the simple set she had drilled the evening before. 3 exchanges, clean and fast. A feint. The disarm came on the 5th movement, the foil turning out of Cassian's hand in a small, bright arc and landing point down in the soft wood of the dais. There was a murmur from the crowd. Then Clara turned to Colonel Tarrant. "Colonel, the test you will wish to see is not the disarm. It is this." She took a clamp from the case. She fixed the foil into it, blade horizontal, edge upward. She produced a small set of brass weights. She hung them, one by one, on the tip of the blade. The blade began to bend. 1 pound, 2, 3. The steel curved down in a long, slow arc, further than any of the judges had expected, until the tip was nearly 6 inches below the level of the hilt. Clara stopped at 3 pounds and held up her hand. She unhooked the weights. The blade sprang back, sang once, and stood perfectly true. She walked to Sterling's table. She did not ask. She lifted one of his finest factory foils, brought it back to the dais, and fixed it in the same clamp. She hung the first weight. The blade dipped. The second weight. The blade dipped further, and the steel made a small, dry sound, the sound of a thing protesting. She lifted the third weight, and before she had quite let it go, the Sterling blade snapped. The broken end struck the dais and skittered across the polished wood. The hall was perfectly silent for the space of a breath. Colonel Tarrant rose slowly from his seat at the judge's table. "Miss Ashford, I have been buying blades for the Horse Guards for 19 years. I have never seen that test fail on a sound blade. I have never seen it pass at 3 pounds on any blade." He looked at Sir Henry, and Sir Henry, after a moment, looked at Mr. Forster, and Mr. Forster set down his pen. "Mr. Sterling," Sir Henry said, "would you care to come forward and address the panel?" Sterling did not come forward. Cassian, standing a little behind Clara on the dais, glanced toward the center of the hall and saw that Sterling had already turned away from his table and was walking, very steadily, toward the side door. One of his grey waistcoated clerks was hurrying after him with a stack of broadsheets. The other was beginning, quietly, to gather up the unsold factory blades from the green cloth. Clara did not watch him go. She was looking at her father's foil, still standing true in the clamp. The park lay south of the great houses of Piccadilly, a green quiet kept aside from the noise of the streets. There was a lake at its center, long and narrow, with willows leaning over the water and a pair of white swans moving along it without seeming to move at all. The afternoon had turned warm. The light came down through the new leaves in soft, shifting patches across the gravel path. Clara walked with the letter folded in her hand. It had been brought to the coffee house that morning by a clerk in dark green livery, sealed with the arms of the Cutler's Hall in red wax. Sir Henry Pelham had written it himself, in a quick, slanted hand that suggested he had not waited for a fair copy. The judges had met that morning at 8. The decision had been unanimous. The exclusive contract for the supply of fine fencing steel to the regimental schools and to the 4 senior sporting academies of the southern counties was awarded to the Ashford Forge of Hatherley for a term of 7 years, with a renewal at the panel's discretion. A first payment of 300 guineas would be drawn upon the cutler's account within the week, to be applied toward the equipping of the workshop and the engagement of additional journeymen. 300 guineas! Clara had read it 3 times in the parlour above the street, and then she had folded it and put it in her pocket and said to Cassian, very quietly, that she should like to walk. So they had walked, south along the Strand, west along Pall Mall, into the park through the small iron gate by the guards' barracks. They had not spoken for most of it. There had not seemed any need. By the lake, she stopped. "My father." She did not look at him. She looked at the swans. "My father once told me that a smith works for 2 patrons, the man who pays him and the man who comes after. The man who pays him buys a blade. The man who comes after inherits a name. He said the name was the harder of the 2 to forge, because a name had to be folded a great many more than 17 times before it would hold." Cassian stood a little behind her, his hat in his hand. "He would be very proud, Miss Ashford." "He would say I had been lucky." "He would say you had been clever, and that luck was the form cleverness took when other people were watching." That made her smile. It was a small smile, and it did not last long, but it was the first she had given anyone all morning. A boy went past along the path with a hoop and a stick. The hoop wobbled, recovered, went on. Somewhere further down the lake, a regimental band was practicing, the brass coming faint through the trees. Cassian. It was the first time he realized that she had used the name without prompting. "Yes." "I should like to ask you something, and I should like you to answer me truthfully, even if the truth is awkward." "I shall try." "When you came to Hatherley in the bottle green coat, when you sat in my parlour with a foil across your knees while it rained, when you stood on the dais yesterday and let me take your blade in front of 400 men, what was your reason?" He took a moment with that. He had been turning it over in his own head for the better part of a week, and he had not yet, until she asked, found a shape for it that he was willing to give away. "On the lawn at Broadmoor," he said, "I made a foolish challenge, and you answered it. I expected, when I sat down with you in the drawing room, to do my duty by the family name and have done with it. You refused. That was a thing I had not been refused before, and I confess it interested me. I told myself, on the road north, that I was coming to see the forge." "And in Hatherley?" "In Hatherley, I saw a young woman who had been holding off a man twice her age and 4 times her means, alone for half a year, because the thing she was protecting was worth protecting. And I found, Miss Ashford, that I did not very much want to go home and leave her to it." The swans moved further along the lake. One of them dipped its long neck under the water and came up again, white and bright. "That is not yet the whole of it," she said. "No." "Tell me the rest, please." He drew a slow breath. "I came to the exhibition because I admire you. I have not admired anyone in this way before, and I find I do not know quite how to carry it. I am not asking, today, for a pledge of any kind. I am not asking you to consider the thing you refused in the drawing room. I am asking, Miss Ashford, only for your permission to call upon you at Hatherley, in the proper way, as one person who would like to know another better, not as a duke, not as a debt of honor, as Cassian. She turned and looked at him then. He had been a great many things to a great many young women in his life. He had been a title. He had been an estate. He had been a polished smile across a ballroom. He had never, before that moment by the lake, been only his own name in a quiet voice, waiting to be answered.
"You may call upon me, Cassian," Clara said.
"Thank you. On Wednesdays. I am at the forge the other 6 days, and I shall not stop being so."
"Wednesdays."
"And you will bring your own foil. Pike has views about your wrist," he laughed. The swans went on along the lake. The band played on, distant through the trees, and the Duke of Broadmoor offered the master smith of Hatherley his arm, and she took it, and they walked back together along the gravel path toward the gate.